The studio audience applauded on cue as Bob Hope walked across the Tonight Show stage in September 1983, but Johnny Carson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Hope extended his hand and Carson took it, holding the grip a fraction of a second too long while the older comedian studied his face. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, something the audience couldn't hear, but Hope understood immediately. Johnny Carson had been hosting The Tonight Show for 21 years by the fall of 1983. He had survived network battles, format changes, guest cancellations, and the endless pressure of producing television 5 nights a week. He had become more than a talk show host. He had become an institution, the final arbiter of what America found funny, the kingmaker who could launch careers with a single gesture of approval. His power in late-night television was absolute. But there was one person he could never escape, one figure who reminded him every time they appeared together that he hadn't built this empire from nothing. Bob Hope had been there first. Bob Hope was 80 years old in 1983. He had been performing professionally for over 6 decades. He had headlined vaudeville, dominated radio, conquered film, and owned television specials that drew massive audiences throughout the 1950s and 1960s. He represented old Hollywood, old show business, the generation that had established the rules Carson now operated under. NBC loved Bob Hope. The network executives revered him, and contractually, Hope had privileges on The Tonight Show that no other guest possessed, including the right to appear whenever he wanted and to extend his segments beyond the standard interview length. Carson had no choice but to accommodate him. The relationship between Carson and Hope had always contained complexity. In the early years of Carson's tenure, Hope had been supportive, appearing frequently to lend legitimacy to the new host. Carson had been grateful then, or at least performed gratitude convincingly. But 21 years had passed. Carson no longer needed validation. He had eclipsed Hope in cultural relevance. The younger audiences who watched The Tonight Show every night didn't remember Hope's radio program or his early films. They knew him primarily as the aging comedian who showed up on Carson's couch several times a year, often promoting his latest television special. The power dynamic had shifted, but the contractual obligations remained unchanged. And that gap between reality and requirement had created something Carson couldn't fully hide anymore. Hope settled into the guest chair, and the interview began with the usual pleasantries. Carson asked about Hope's recent golf tournament. Hope delivered a prepared joke about his score. The audience laughed. Ed McMahon chuckled from his position off camera. Everything appeared normal. But Hope was watching Carson's face with unusual attention, studying the small muscle movements around his eyes, the exact timing of his reactions, the subtle shift in posture when certain topics arose. Hope had spent 60 years reading audiences and reading fellow performers. He knew when someone was going through the motions. Carson asked about Hope's upcoming NBC special scheduled for November. Hope began describing the guest list, dropping names of singers and actors who had agreed to appear. Carson nodded along, his professional smile fixed in place. He had heard versions of this conversation dozens of times before. Hope's specials followed a predictable formula, mixing musical numbers with sketch comedy and patriotic segments. They represented an older style of television variety entertainment that felt increasingly disconnected from what Carson's Tonight Show had become. Carson's show was conversational, intimate, built around spontaneous moments and authentic reactions. Hope's specials were scripted productions designed to appeal to the broadest possible demographic. They were different visions of what entertainment meant, different philosophies about how to connect with audiences. But NBC treated Hope's specials as major events. The network promoted them heavily, often preempting regular programming to accommodate them. Executives still believed that Bob Hope represented safety, reliability, the kind of programming that wouldn't offend sponsors or alienate older viewers. Carson understood the business logic. He had been in television long enough to recognize that networks valued predictability over innovation. But understanding something intellectually didn't prevent the quiet frustration that accumulated over years of watching the network celebrate a performer whose best work existed in the past, while Carson himself created new television every single night. Hope finished discussing his special, and the conversation shifted to his recent trip to entertain troops overseas. This was Hope's signature cause, the work he was most proud of, the reason many people still considered him untouchable despite the evolution of comedy. Carson asked the expected questions about where Hope had traveled and what the experience had been like. Hope answered with rehearsed anecdotes, stories he had told on numerous talk shows and in countless interviews. The material was well-worn, but delivered with professional precision. Hope knew how to work a room, how to build to a punchline, how to ride applause. These were skills he had developed before Carson was born. But something in Carson's questioning had changed. His tone remained polite, but the questions themselves had started to contain an edge, a subtle probing quality that suggested he wasn't simply facilitating Hope's promotional tour anymore. Carson asked how many times Hope had performed for troops over the years. Hope gave an approximate number. Carson asked if the experience had changed much since the 1940s. Hope said the fundamentals remained the same, that soldiers still appreciated entertainment regardless of the era. Carson paused, then asked if Hope ever felt like the style of comedy that worked for troops in 1943 might feel different to soldiers in 1983. The question hung in the air for a moment. The studio audience didn't react because they weren't sure if it was a setup for a joke or something else. Ed McMahon shifted slightly in his chair. Hope's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He recognized what was happening. Carson wasn't just making conversation anymore. He was asking a real question, one that contained an implicit critique. Hope had been in show business too long to miss the implication. Carson was suggesting that Hope's comedy might be outdated, that the performer who had once defined American humor had become a relic, performing for audiences who appreciated the gesture more than the material itself. Hope could have deflected. He could have made a joke, turned the question into a humorous exchange, and moved the conversation back to safer territory. That's what the old rules of talk show television would have dictated. The guest doesn't challenge the host. The interview maintains a collaborative fiction where everyone is friendly and nothing truly uncomfortable ever surfaces. But Hope had helped create those rules back when Carson was still in high school. He understood them completely, and he chose to break them. Hope leaned forward slightly and looked directly at Carson. His voice remained casual, conversational, but his words were precise. He said that comedy fundamentals never really change, that what makes people laugh has remained remarkably consistent throughout his entire career. He said that young comedians often mistake novelty for innovation, confusing changes in style with changes in substance. He said that he had watched countless performers come and go, each one convinced they had discovered something new, only to realize they were working with the same basic material comedians had been using for 100 years. And then, he said something that made Carson's smile freeze completely. He said that even the best talk show hosts were really just doing a version of what variety hosts had been doing for decades, that the format Carson had mastered so brilliantly was still built on foundations that people like Hope had laid down long before The Tonight Show existed. The statement was delivered without hostility. Hope's tone remained friendly, almost professorial, but the message was unmistakable. Hope was reminding Carson that his success existed within a tradition Hope had helped establish. He was asserting continuity, claiming ownership of the lineage, refusing to accept that Carson's era had somehow superseded or invalidated what had come before. And he was doing it on Carson's own show, in front of Carson's audience, with cameras recording every moment. Carson's response revealed everything. For just a few seconds, his professional mask slipped. His smile tightened. His eyes went cold. The easy charm that usually defined his on-camera presence vanished, replaced by something harder and more defensive. Everyone watching could see it, the sudden shift from gracious host to someone who had just been challenged and didn't like it. Then, just as quickly, Carson recovered. The smile returned. His posture relaxed. He made a small joke about learning from the masters, and the audience laughed, grateful for the release of tension. But Hope had seen what he needed to see. He had confirmed what he had suspected when Carson first took his hand that evening. The resentment was real. The interview continued for another 8 minutes. Both men retreated to safer topics, discussing golf and celebrity friends and upcoming projects. The conversation appeared to return to normal. But the atmosphere had changed. Carson's questions became more perfunctory, his reactions more automatic. Hope's answers grew slightly more pointed, his stories selected to emphasize his longevity and continued relevance. They were both performing now, with full awareness of what had just happened, playing out the remainder of the segment while calculating what it meant. When the interview finally ended and they went to commercial break, Carson shook Hope's hand again with impeccable professionalism. The audience applauded. Hope waved and exited the stage. Carson turned to Ed McMahon and made a light-hearted comment about Hope's energy level. Everything appeared cordial. But the production staff, who had worked with Carson for years, recognized the signs. His jaw was tight. His movements were slightly more controlled than usual. He was angry, or perhaps something more complex than anger. He was exposed. The Tonight Show had always functioned as Carson's protected space, the kingdom where he controlled every variable and determined every outcome. Guests appeared at his invitation. Conversations flowed according to his timing. Success or failure depended on his reactions. He could make someone a star with enthusiastic laughter or quietly destroy their career with polite indifference. That power had been carefully accumulated over 2 decades of consistent excellence, night after night of proving himself irreplaceable. But Bob Hope didn't operate within that system. Hope had his own power, his own history, his own relationship with NBC that predated Carson's and contained guarantees Carson couldn't override. Hope was the one guest who could walk onto The Tonight Show and remind everyone watching that Johnny Carson wasn't the beginning of television comedy. He was just the current occupant of a chair that someone else would eventually fill. The conflict between Carson and Hope represented something larger than personal animosity. It embodied the eternal tension between established authority and current power, between historical significance and present relevance. Hope had earned his position through decades of consistent work and undeniable achievement. He had shaped American comedy through multiple mediums and multiple generations. His contributions were real and substantial. But by 1983, those contributions existed primarily in the past. His style of comedy had become associated with an earlier era. His television specials drew respectable ratings, but lacked cultural impact. His appearances on talk shows felt more like obligatory acknowledgments of a living legend than genuine attempts to engage with what he was currently creating. Carson, by contrast, was creating cultural moments every night. His show influenced what America talked about the next morning. His reactions determined which comedians got opportunities and which ones disappeared. His taste shaped the evolution of comedy throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. He represented the present tense of entertainment, the immediate and the relevant. But that present tense came with its own form of insecurity. Carson knew that his power depended entirely on his current performance. The moment he stopped being essential, the moment audiences began to prefer someone else, his authority would evaporate. He would become what Bob Hope had become, a respected figure from the past who appeared on other people's shows to promote projects that felt disconnected from the current cultural moment. That fear, the knowledge that his reign was temporary and that time would eventually transform him into the very thing he now resented, created a particular kind of psychological pressure. Carson dealt with it through control, through managing every aspect of his show with obsessive attention to detail, through maintaining professional distance from almost everyone in his life. But he couldn't control Bob Hope. He couldn't prevent NBC from giving Hope special privileges. He couldn't change the fact that network executives who were barely born when Hope started performing still treated him with reverence that occasionally felt greater than what they showed Carson. And he couldn't make Hope go away or fade into obscurity as long as the older comedian remained physically capable and contractually protected. The 1983 confrontation didn't create the tension between them. It simply made visible what had been accumulating for years. In earlier Tonight Show appearances, Hope had occasionally made gentle jokes about Carson's success, comments that could be interpreted as good-natured ribbing, but that Carson's staff sometimes noticed made him uncomfortable. Hope would reference how well Carson was doing, how much money he must be making, how nice it was to see someone appreciate the format that people like Hope had pioneered. The comments were always delivered with a smile, always wrapped in apparent friendliness. But they contained an underlying assertion of primacy, a refusal to treat Carson as the originator of something new rather than the current practitioner of something old. Carson typically responded with self-deprecating humor, playing the modest Midwestern boy who had gotten lucky. But people who knew him understood that the modesty was performance, that Carson possessed a fierce pride in his work and a clear-eyed assessment of his own importance to American television. He knew he was exceptional. He knew that what he did every night required unique skills that very few people possessed. And he resented having to perform gratitude towards someone whose career accomplishments, however impressive historically, didn't include doing what Carson did, creating spontaneous, compelling television 5 nights a week for over 2 decades without significant decline in quality. The resentment wasn't entirely rational. Carson understood intellectually that different eras required different skills, that Hope's achievements in his own time were legitimate and impressive. But rationality rarely governs feelings about recognition and respect, especially in professions built around ego and public validation. Carson wanted to be understood as someone who had created something new, not someone who had simply inherited and managed a format someone else invented. He wanted his innovation recognized, his particular genius acknowledged as distinct and original. But as long as Bob Hope kept appearing on his show, kept being celebrated by the network, kept carrying himself with the confidence of someone whose place in history was secure, Carson couldn't escape the feeling that he was being subtly diminished, treated as talented but ultimately replaceable. Hope's decision to confront that resentment openly, rather than allowing it to remain subtext, changed the nature of their relationship permanently. After the September 1983 interview, Hope continued to appear on The Tonight Show, but the appearances became less frequent. The conversations remained professional, but lost any pretense of warmth. Carson stopped asking questions that might invite Hope to reflect on career longevity or the evolution of comedy. Hope stopped making comments about The Tonight Show format or Carson's success within it. They performed their respective roles with technical precision, but without genuine connection. NBC executives noticed the change, but chose not to address it directly. The network had no interest in mediating a conflict between two of its most important performers. As long as both men continued to fulfill their obligations and maintain public professionalism, the underlying tension could be ignored. But privately, executives began to schedule Hope's Tonight Show appearances more carefully, avoiding dates when Carson seemed particularly stressed or when other factors might create additional friction. The decision reflected the reality that while the network still valued Bob Hope's legacy and continued to air his specials, they understood clearly that Johnny Carson was irreplaceable in a way that Hope no longer was. The shift in power, gradual and inevitable, became more apparent as the 1980s progressed. Hope's television specials began drawing smaller audiences. His style of comedy, once mainstream and universal, started to feel specifically tailored to older demographics. Younger viewers who had grown up watching Carson found Hope's material predictable and old-fashioned. The patriotic themes that had made Hope beloved during World War II and the Cold War felt less compelling in an era of growing cynicism about American institutions. Hope remained famous, remained respected, but his cultural relevance continued to diminish. Carson, meanwhile, maintained his position as the central figure in late-night television. His ratings remained strong. His influence over comedy careers remained absolute. New hosts who emerged in the 1980s, people like David Letterman and Jay Leno, were measured against Carson's standard. They studied his timing, his interview techniques, his ability to recover from jokes that failed. Carson had become the template, the model that defined what a late-night host should be. That position, the one he had wanted Bob Hope to acknowledge, was now secure, regardless of what Hope or anyone else from the older generation believed. But the confrontation in 1983 had revealed something Carson couldn't completely reconcile. He had wanted Hope's approval, wanted the older comedian to recognize that what Carson did was different and special, not just competent execution of an existing format. The desire for that validation, the need to be seen as an innovator rather than an inheritor, exposed a vulnerability Carson rarely allowed to surface. He had spent his career projecting confidence and control, building a persona that appeared completely secure in its own excellence. But the moment when Hope challenged him, the few seconds when his mask slipped and genuine emotion showed through, demonstrated that Carson still cared what the previous generation thought, still wanted to be understood as something more than just another performer in a long line of performers. That vulnerability, once exposed, became something Carson worked even harder to conceal. His interviews in the years following the Hope confrontation became slightly more guarded. His public persona grew more distant. He gave fewer interviews to journalists, shared less about his private thoughts and feelings. The control he exercised over his public image, already substantial, became almost total. He seemed determined to never again allow anyone to see the insecurity or resentment or need for validation that had shown through during those few seconds with Bob Hope. Hope, for his part, never publicly discussed what had happened during the interview. He continued to perform, continued to make television specials, continued to appear at public events and accept awards. But he also seemed to understand that something had shifted, that the conversation about comedy and legacy and who mattered was moving forward without him. His references to the younger generation of comedians became less pointed. His assertions about comedy fundamentals remaining constant became less frequent. He appeared to accept, with whatever private feelings that acceptance required, that his era had definitively ended, and that Carson's era, however temporary it might ultimately prove to be, was now the present reality. The relationship between the two men in their final years working in television remained cordial but distant. They appeared together at industry events occasionally, always professional, always respectful, but without real warmth. When Hope made his last appearance on The Tonight Show in 1991, a year before Carson retired, the interview was pleasant and nostalgic. They discussed shared memories and mutual friends. They didn't reference their confrontation or the years of accumulated tension. Everything was smooth and controlled and completely empty of genuine emotion. It was professional performance at the highest level, two masters of their craft, demonstrating that they could maintain appearances regardless of what they actually felt. Carson retired from The Tonight Show in May 1992, leaving on his own terms with his reputation intact and his legacy secure. Hope continued performing until his late 90s, appearing at special events and tributes, always received with respect and appreciation for his historical significance. They never reconciled in any meaningful sense, because there was nothing specific to reconcile. They hadn't fought over a particular incident or disagreement. They had simply represented different moments in the evolution of American entertainment, different philosophies about what comedy meant and how power in show business should be understood. Those differences couldn't be resolved through conversation or gesture. They were structural, built into who each man was and what each man's career represented. The confrontation in 1983 mattered not because it changed anything concrete, but because it made visible what had always existed beneath the surface of their relationship. It revealed that Johnny Carson, for all his success and power and cultural dominance, still carried resentment toward the generation that had preceded him and still needed validation he couldn't quite receive. It showed that Bob Hope, even in his 80s, still possessed enough pride and clarity to refuse to pretend that Carson had invented something entirely new rather than perfected something that had existed before him. And it demonstrated that television, despite its appearance of spontaneity and authenticity, was actually built on carefully maintained fictions that occasionally cracked under the pressure of genuine emotion. Both men were brilliant at what they did. Both men deserved the success they achieved. but they existed in fundamentally different relationships to time and legacy. Hope's achievements were secure but finished, monuments to be preserved and honored but not actively built upon. Carson's achievements were immediate and vital, but carried the constant awareness that they too would eventually become historical artifacts, that someone would eventually sit in his chair and feel toward him exactly what he had felt toward Hope. That knowledge, the certainty of obsolescence despite present dominance, was perhaps the real source of the tension between them. Hope represented Carson's future, the inevitable transformation from essential to emeritus. And Carson, despite all his control and all his talent, couldn't prevent that future from arriving. The September 1983 interview lasted less than 15 minutes. Most viewers probably forgot about it within days, but for the two men involved, it represented a moment of complete clarity, a brief period when the performance dropped and the reality showed through. Carson understood that Hope saw his resentment. Hope understood that Carson would never forgive him for still being there, still carrying authority that Carson couldn't diminish. And both men understood that they would continue performing their professional relationship regardless, that show business required maintaining appearances even when everyone involved knew exactly what those appearances were hiding. That was perhaps the final lesson of their confrontation. Television wasn't about truth or authenticity. It was about control and performance and managing what audiences were allowed to see. Both Carson and Hope had mastered that understanding. Their conflict arose not from failure to perform, but from a brief moment when performance wasn't quite enough, when the gap between surface and reality became visible. And then, professionals that they were, they closed that gap and continued forward, two men who understood show business completely, and themselves perhaps not quite well enough.